You're in the middle of a conversation, a perfectly ordinary conversation with someone you've known for years, and you reach for a word that has always been there. A simple word. A word you've used hundreds of times. And for a few unsettling seconds, it simply isn't there. You feel it somewhere at the edge of your mind, like something just out of reach in a dark room. And then either it surfaces slowly, or you talk around it and move on. But the feeling stays with you longer than the conversation does. Or perhaps it's the other version. You walk into a room knowing exactly why you went there, and by the time you cross the threshold, the reason has dissolved completely. You stand for a moment, genuinely uncertain, then retrace your steps, hoping the kitchen or the hallway will remind you what you needed. If you recognize either of those moments, you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not experiencing the inevitable, unchangeable decline that most people assume is simply what happens to the mind after 60. What you may be experiencing has a name, a mechanism, and increasingly a set of specific dietary interventions with real evidence behind them. It's called brain fog. And one of the most significant and least discussed contributors to it sits not in your skull, but in your gut. I'm Dr. Naira Stein, and today I want to have a conversation that I believe genuinely surprises most older adults the first time they hear it. I want to talk about the relationship between your digestive system and your brain, about why that relationship changes after 60 in ways that directly affect memory, focus, and mental clarity, and about 6 specific fermented foods that support the biological pathway responsible for clearing the fog. These are not exotic ingredients or expensive supplements. They are real foods available in most grocery stores, with research behind them that is specific enough and consistent enough that I think you deserve to understand it clearly. Stay with me through this. What you learn in the next few minutes may be the most genuinely useful thing you've read about your memory in years. The gut-brain connection. Why your stomach is running your mind more than you think. Most people think of the brain and the digestive system as separate departments. The brain handles thinking, memory, and mood. The gut handles food. They communicate occasionally, but operate largely independently. This turns out to be one of the most consequential misunderstandings in popular health thinking, and the emerging science of the gut-brain axis has spent the last 2 decades systematically dismantling it. Here is the reality. Your gut contains approximately 100 million neurons, more than your spinal cord. It produces around 90% of your body's serotonin, the neurotransmitter most closely associated with mood stability and cognitive calm. It hosts somewhere between 38 and 100 trillion microbial organisms, bacteria, fungi, archaea, collectively called the gut microbiome, which together weigh roughly the same as your brain and influence its function in ways that are only now being fully appreciated. The channel through which this influence travels is called the gut-brain axis, a bidirectional communication network involving the vagus nerve, the immune system, the endocrine system, and the bloodstream. Messages travel in both directions, but the traffic is surprisingly asymmetric. Approximately 80% of the fibers in the vagus nerve carry signals from the gut upward to the brain, not the other way around. Your gut is, in a very literal sense, talking to your brain almost constantly. What it says depends on the composition of the microbiome doing the talking. A microbiome rich in diverse, beneficial bacterial species produces short-chain fatty acids, neurotrophic peptides, and anti-inflammatory compounds that support neuronal health, protect the blood-brain barrier, and promote the growth of new neural connections, a process called neuroplasticity that does not stop at 60 or 70 or 80. A microbiome that has shifted toward less diverse, more inflammatory species, which is exactly what happens progressively with age, particularly in the context of a low-fiber diet, antibiotic use, chronic stress, and reduced physical activity, produces a different set of signals entirely. Elevated inflammatory cytokines, disrupted neurotransmitter synthesis, increased permeability of the blood-brain barrier, reduced production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the compound most directly responsible for memory consolidation and cognitive resilience. This is the biological basis of brain fog, not a failing mind, a disrupted gut-brain conversation producing the neurological equivalent of static on a line that was once clear. The question is, what specifically restores that conversation? And the answer, supported by a growing body of well-designed research, centers on fermented foods. Foods that deliver live beneficial bacteria, their metabolic byproducts, and the bioavailable nutrients that a compromised microbiome can no longer reliably extract from ordinary food alone. Why fermented foods work differently from ordinary probiotics. Before naming the 6 foods, I want to address something that comes up every time I have this conversation. Many older adults are already taking a probiotic supplement, a capsule or powder purchased from a pharmacy or health food store. And the natural question is, if I'm already taking probiotics, why would fermented food add anything? The answer is genuinely important and worth understanding. Probiotic supplements typically contain between 1 and 50 billion colony-forming units of a small number of specific bacterial strains, usually 2 to 5. They are useful in specific clinical contexts, but they arrive in the gut in isolation, without the food matrix, the organic acids, the bioactive peptides, the enzymes, and the full microbial community that surround the bacteria in a naturally fermented food. A traditionally fermented food, yogurt, kimchi, kefir, sauerkraut, delivers not only live bacteria, but the environment those bacteria created during fermentation. Lactic acid, acetic acid, B vitamins synthesized during the fermentation process, partially digested proteins that are more bioavailable than their unfermented counterparts, and a range of bioactive compounds that the bacteria produced as metabolic byproducts. Research published in the journal Cell in 2021, one of the most rigorous dietary microbiome studies conducted in adults, found that a high fermented food diet increased microbiome diversity and decreased systemic inflammatory markers more effectively than a high-fiber diet alone over the same time period. The diversity increase was rapid, measurable within weeks, and the inflammatory reduction was consistent across participants. Microbiome diversity is the single most reliable predictor of gut-brain axis function in the research literature. A more diverse microbiome means more redundancy, more stability, and more robust production of the neurotransmitter precursors and anti-inflammatory compounds that the brain depends on. 6 fermented foods, introduced consistently and strategically into the daily diet, contribute to that diversity in a way that isolated probiotic strains simply cannot replicate. Fermented food 1. Kefir. Kefir is a fermented milk drink with a thin, pourable consistency and a mildly tangy flavor, somewhere between yogurt and buttermilk, and it is the single most microbiome-diverse fermented dairy food commonly available in grocery stores. Where yogurt typically contains 2 to 7 bacterial strains, traditional kefir contains between 30 and 50 distinct microbial species, including both bacteria and beneficial yeasts, that interact synergistically within the gut environment. The cognitive relevance of kefir is specific and well documented. It is one of the most concentrated dietary sources of tryptophan, the amino acid precursor to serotonin, in a form that is substantially more bioavailable than tryptophan from unfermented dairy or plant sources. The fermentation process partially breaks down the milk proteins surrounding tryptophan, freeing it for more efficient intestinal absorption and subsequent conversion to serotonin in the gut lining. Higher gut serotonin production is associated with better mood regulation, reduced anxiety, and, through serotonin's role in modulating hippocampal activity, improved memory consolidation and recall. Kefir also contains a meaningful concentration of GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, responsible for quieting the neural overactivity associated with cognitive fatigue and the kind of mental restlessness that makes concentration difficult. Research examining kefir consumption and cognitive markers in adults over 60 has found associations with improved processing speed, reduced self-reported brain fog, and better performance on working memory assessments. 1 cup of plain, unsweetened kefir daily, consumed in the morning alongside breakfast or as a mid-morning drink, is a practical and evidence-supported starting point. Choose whole milk kefir where possible. The fat matrix improves the survival of the live cultures through the stomach's acidic environment, ensuring more organisms reach the large intestine, where they exert their beneficial effects. Fermented food 2. Kimchi. Kimchi is a Korean fermented vegetable preparation, most commonly made from Napa cabbage and Korean radish with garlic, ginger, chili, and salt, and it represents one of the most nutritionally complex fermented foods available, combining the probiotic benefit of live lactobacillus bacteria with a remarkable array of prebiotic fibers, antioxidants, and anti-inflammatory compounds that work on the gut-brain axis through multiple simultaneous pathways. The bacterial strains dominant in traditionally prepared kimchi, particularly Lactobacillus plantarum and Lactobacillus brevis, have been specifically studied for their effects on the gut-brain axis and neuroinflammation. Neuroinflammation, inflammation within the brain tissue and the surrounding blood-brain barrier, is now understood to be one of the most significant contributors to age-related cognitive decline and brain fog. It is driven by the same systemic inflammatory cytokines that originate, in part, from a dysbiotic gut microbiome. Lactobacillus plantarum specifically has been shown to reduce circulating levels of interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, two of the inflammatory messengers most closely linked to cognitive impairment, through mechanisms that appear to involve both direct immune modulation and the strengthening of the intestinal barrier that prevents inflammatory bacterial byproducts from entering the bloodstream. The garlic and ginger in kimchi add a separate and complementary benefit. Both contain prebiotic compounds that feed the beneficial bacteria already established in the gut, amplifying the impact of the live cultures delivered by the kimchi itself. This prebiotic-probiotic combination, sometimes called a symbiotic effect, produces a more sustained and significant microbiome shift than either component achieves independently. A small serving of kimchi, 2 to 4 tablespoons, alongside a meal once or twice daily, is an achievable and effective dose for those new to the food. It can be eaten as a side dish, added to scrambled eggs, stirred into grain bowls, or simply eaten directly from the jar as a condiment. Those sensitive to spice can seek out milder kimchi preparations or introduce it gradually in very small amounts, allowing the digestive system to adjust over the first 1 to 2 weeks. Fermented Food 3. Plain live culture yogurt. Plain live culture yogurt, not sweetened, not flavored, but genuine yogurt containing active bacterial cultures, is the most familiar fermented food for most Western adults over 60, and its cognitive benefits, while perhaps less dramatic than some of the other foods on this list, are supported by some of the most extensive long-term research available on any single dietary intervention. The key distinction is between yogurt that genuinely contains live active cultures and yogurt that has been heat-treated after fermentation, a process that kills the bacteria and leaves only the flavor and texture of fermented milk, without any of its probiotic benefit. Many commercial yogurts are heat-treated for shelf stability. Look specifically for the words live active cultures or contains live cultures on the label, and prefer refrigerated varieties over shelf-stable ones. The mechanism most relevant to brain fog in older adults is yogurt's effect on the gut-derived inflammatory load. A 2019 study published in Brain Behavior and Immunity followed adults over 60 for 12 weeks and found that regular consumption of live culture yogurt was associated with a measurable reduction in serum inflammatory markers, specifically C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, alongside participant-reported improvements in cognitive clarity and emotional stability. The researchers attributed this primarily to the modulation of gut microbiome composition and the consequent reduction in gut-derived inflammatory signaling to the brain. Yogurt also delivers a concentrated source of vitamin B12, a nutrient whose deficiency is extraordinarily common in adults over 60 due to age-related decline in the production of intrinsic factor, the stomach compound required for B12 absorption. B12 deficiency is one of the most directly reversible causes of brain fog, memory impairment, and cognitive slowdown in older adults, and it is estimated to affect between 10 and 30% of people over 60 to a clinically meaningful degree. The B12 in fermented dairy is more bioavailable than from unfermented sources because fermentation partially liberates it from its protein-bound form, making absorption less dependent on the intrinsic factor pathway that has declined with age. A cup of plain, full-fat, or 2% live culture yogurt daily, with berries, a small drizzle of honey, or simply on its own, is one of the most practical, affordable, and well-researched dietary additions for cognitive clarity in older adults. Sauerkraut, traditionally fermented cabbage, is one of the oldest preserved foods in human history, and one of the most misunderstood in the context of modern nutrition, primarily because the jarred sauerkraut sold in most supermarkets has been pasteurized and contains no live cultures whatsoever. This distinction is critical and worth repeating clearly. Pasteurized sauerkraut, heated to kill bacteria for shelf stability, is a pleasant condiment. It is not a probiotic food. Raw, unpasteurized sauerkraut, found in the refrigerated section, typically in glass jars with no vinegar in the ingredients list, is a genuinely powerful fermented food whose cognitive benefits are distinct and specific. Authentic fermented sauerkraut is produced through lactofermentation, the same lactic acid bacterial process that produces kimchi, and delivers a significant concentration of lactobacillus species, alongside vitamin C, vitamin K2, and a remarkable concentration of glucosinolates from the cabbage that are converted by gut bacteria into isothiocyanates, compounds with well-documented anti-neuroinflammatory properties. Vitamin K2, in particular, has received growing research attention in the context of cognitive health. It is involved in the synthesis of sphingolipids, fats that form a critical component of the myelin sheaths surrounding nerve fibers. Degradation of myelin is one of the structural contributors to slowed neural transmission and the processing delays that manifest as brain fog. Dietary K2 from fermented foods supports myelin maintenance through a mechanism that K1, the form found in leafy greens, does not replicate. 2 tablespoons of raw, unpasteurized sauerkraut per day is a practical serving size. It pairs well with eggs, sits alongside any grain or protein dish, and can be eaten directly as a small side serving with the main meal of the day. The brine, the liquid in the jar, carries its own concentration of live bacteria and bioactive organic acids, and a small amount consumed alongside the sauerkraut itself adds to the total beneficial impact. Fermented Food 5. Miso. Miso is a Japanese fermented paste made from soybeans combined with salt and koji, a mold called Aspergillus oryzae, and sometimes rice, barley, or other grains. It is most familiar as the base of miso soup, but its applications extend well beyond soup, and its specific nutritional profile makes it one of the more cognitively relevant fermented foods available to older adults. The fermentation of soybeans with koji produces several compounds with direct neurological relevance. The process generates significant quantities of nattokinase, an enzyme with fibrinolytic properties, meaning it supports the breakdown of fibrin, a protein involved in blood clotting, and substantially increases the bioavailability of isoflavones, the soy-derived compounds whose associations with cognitive function have been studied most extensively in postmenopausal women. Research published in the Journal of Nutrition found that fermented soy products produce significantly greater cognitive benefits than unfermented soy, suggesting that the fermentation process itself, rather than simply the soy content, is responsible for the observed effects. Miso also undergoes extensive protein hydrolysis during fermentation. The long chains of soy protein are broken down into shorter peptides and free amino acids, many of which function as precursors to neurotransmitters, including dopamine and GABA. The resulting amino acid profile is substantially more bioavailable than that of unfermented soy protein, making miso a meaningful contributor to neurotransmitter synthesis in older adults whose digestive efficiency has declined. One important note for older adults managing blood pressure. Miso is a high-sodium food, and sodium awareness is appropriate, particularly for those with hypertension. The circulatory benefits of the fermented compounds can be obtained from a modest daily serving, 1 teaspoon dissolved in warm water as a simple broth, or used as a seasoning in small amounts, without requiring the sodium content of a full restaurant-style miso soup. Fermented Food 6. Tempeh. Tempeh is fermented whole soybean cake, originating in Indonesia, and it is the most protein-dense fermented food on this list, as well as the one whose specific cognitive benefits are least discussed in mainstream health conversations, and most compelling in the research that examines them directly. Unlike miso, which is a paste made from ground fermented soybeans, tempeh is made from whole soybeans bound together by the mycelium of Rhizopus oligosporus, a beneficial fungal culture that ferments the beans over 24 to 48 hours and produces a firm, sliceable cake with a nutty, slightly earthy flavor. The fermentation process dramatically changes the nutritional character of the soybeans. Phytic acid, the compound in whole grains and legumes that binds to minerals and prevents their absorption, is largely broken down during fermentation, freeing zinc, iron, magnesium, and manganese for intestinal absorption. These minerals are all involved in cognitive function and are all commonly deficient in older adults. Zinc is particularly relevant. It plays a direct role in the regulation of glutamate signaling in the hippocampus, the brain region most directly associated with memory formation. And zinc deficiency in older adults has been specifically associated with increased susceptibility to cognitive decline and reduced synaptic plasticity. The bioavailable zinc in tempeh is significantly more accessible than zinc from unfermented legumes or whole grains, making tempeh one of the more effective dietary sources for restoring adequate levels in older adults whose absorption has declined with age. Tempeh also delivers around 20 grams of complete protein per half-cup serving, supporting the muscle protein synthesis discussed in other contexts, but equally important here, because adequate dietary protein is required for the synthesis of the enzymes, neurotransmitter precursors, and structural brain proteins that cognitive function depends on. It can be sliced and pan-fried with a small amount of olive oil, crumbled into stir-fries, marinated and grilled, or added to grain bowls. Its flavor is mild enough to absorb whatever seasoning surrounds it, making it one of the more versatile proteins available for older adults building a cognitively supportive diet. How to introduce these foods practically. A realistic daily plan. One of the most common mistakes people make when they first learn about fermented foods and gut health is attempting to add all 6 simultaneously. This is understandable. The research is compelling and the motivation is genuine, but it frequently produces a different outcome than intended. Introducing multiple fermented foods quickly can temporarily disturb the gut microbiome's existing balance, producing bloating, flatulence, or loose stools in the first week that discourages continuation. The discomfort is not dangerous, but it is unnecessary and avoidable with a more gradual approach. Begin with one food in the first week. Kefir in the morning is an excellent starting point because it is easy to incorporate, mild in flavor, and produces the broadest initial strain diversity. 1 cup in the morning for 7 days. Observe how your digestive system responds. Most people notice no disruption at all. Some notice a mild increase in gas for 2 to 3 days that resolves without intervention as the microbiome adjusts. In the second week, add a small serving of either plain yogurt or sauerkraut as a second daily fermented food. In the third week, introduce kimchi alongside a meal. By the end of the first month, a daily pattern that includes kefir at breakfast, yogurt as a snack, kimchi or sauerkraut with the main meal, and miso or tempeh 2 to 3 times a week is both practical and sufficiently diverse to produce the microbiome changes that the research associates with reduced brain fog and improved cognitive clarity. The timeline for noticing cognitive changes is typically 4 to 8 weeks of consistent consumption. Microbiome composition shifts are measurable within 2 weeks, but the downstream effects on the gut-brain axis, reduced neuroinflammation, improved neurotransmitter synthesis, better blood-brain barrier integrity, accumulate more gradually, and express themselves cognitively over a longer horizon. This is not a quick fix. It is a structural restoration of a biological system that has been changing for years, and it responds to consistent, patient attention rather than dramatic short-term intervention. As the microbiome begins to shift toward greater diversity and the gut-brain conversation becomes clearer, the changes tend to appear in a predictable sequence that is worth knowing in advance, so you recognize them as progress rather than coincidence. The first changes are usually digestive. More regular bowel movements, less bloating, and a reduction in the post-meal heaviness or discomfort that many older adults have come to accept as normal. These are signs of improved microbial balance in the gut itself, before the upstream cognitive effects have fully materialized. The second set of changes tends to be emotional. A more stable mood through the day. Less of the irritability or low-grade anxiety that often accompanies gut dysbiosis through the serotonin pathway. Slightly better sleep quality, which itself has a profound effect on the clarity of morning thinking, since the brain's lymphatic waste clearance system operates almost exclusively during deep sleep. The third set of changes, the ones most people are most motivated by, are the cognitive ones. A reduction in the word retrieval delays, shorter recovery from mental fatigue, an easier time holding a train of thought through a longer task. These are not dramatic transformations that arrive on a particular Tuesday. They are gradual restorations of function that accumulate quietly and become apparent, often, only when you realize that something you had given up on is simply present again. The brain fog that so many people over 60 experience, and so many accept as inevitable, is not, in the majority of cases, the beginning of something irreversible. It is, often, the symptom of a disrupted conversation between a gut that has shifted away from diversity and health and a brain that is receiving less of the support it depends on from the microbiome that shapes its daily chemistry. 6 fermented foods. Introduced gradually, eaten consistently. Giving the gut microbiome the diversity and the live cultures it needs to restore the conversation that should have been happening all along. Kefir in the morning, yogurt through the day, kimchi and sauerkraut alongside meals. Miso as a quiet, warming broth. Tempeh as a protein that does far more than feed your muscles. These are not treatments, they are foods. Ancient foods, eaten by human beings for thousands of years across every culture on Earth, before anyone understood the science of why they worked. We understand the science now, and it is specific, and it is consistent, and it points clearly toward the gut as one of the most accessible and most underutilized levers available for protecting cognitive health as we age. I'm Dr. Naira Stein. Your mind is not simply winding down. It is responding to its environment, to what you eat, to what you give it, to the biological conversation happening right now between your gut and your brain. Change the conversation. Give the gut what it needs to speak clearly, and listen for what comes back. Take good care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.